You may have recognized when you read a piece of literature that in that literature it reminds you of something from the past. Well, oftentimes authors will actually draw from some time in history and use that as the impetus for their writing in a text. In this case, today we're going to talk about the historical context, the parallels between the life of an author, in this case Harper Lee, and the narrator, Scout Finch, in To Kill a Mockingbird, and look at some of the patterns that exist between the author's life as well as our narrator, 6-year-old Scout Finch. Some of the parallels from her life, Harper Lee, some would argue that Scout and Harper Lee are really just one and the same, and Scout is just a version of Harper Lee when she was 6, which is very much quite possible. Harper Lee was born in 1926, which is around the setting of the time in which To Kill a Mockingbird takes place. And Harper Lee at the time was also about 6 years old, so she's drawing on her experience in a time that was very challenging. So she experienced quite a bit of things in which she questioned about life and about justice and about poverty. And so in this case, she did write about it through the lens of a young girl, which is really significant. We'll discuss later about the point of view and her choice in narrator. So Harper Lee, the author, born in Monroeville, Alabama, we know that the text To Kill a Mockingbird takes place in Macomb, Alabama. So similar settings, similar conditions. And another pattern or parallel that exists in the text would be the relationship between the father and the daughter. We learn Atticus is a little bit withdrawn, but he does have a huge or tremendous influence on his daughter, Scout Finch, in the text, very similar to Harper Lee and her father. Both men, by the way, were attorneys or lawyers, and so Harper Lee would like to be, they spent much time in the courthouse, just like Scout Finch. So also, another parallel that exists in the text is the character of Boo Radley. And we are introduced to him very early. We know him as a recluse who sort of keeps to himself in his home. We rarely ever see or hear from him for years, but the curiosity of the young children is what sort of sets the stage in the very beginning, the initial stages of the text. Well, in the life of Harper Lee, some have argued that there was someone who was very much like Boo Radley in her own community, and so this obsession sort of translates to the text as well. A page from history. So there is a big trial in Scottsboro, Alabama. There were 9 black men who were accused of raping 2 white women. And so also when we look in To Kill a Mockingbird, there's a character of Tom Robinson who is accused of doing the same thing in the text. So again, we're taking Harper Lee's experience from the lens of a 6-year-old child and sort of seeing from her own eyes her own experience and her sort of dealing with and wrestling with this idea of justice throughout her life, and in this case, the text. Now, the character of Dill, many would argue, is really one of Harper Lee's closest friends and companions growing up. He was actually a famous author. His name was Truman Capote, and he and Lee, Harper Lee, as well as her brother, played with Capote every summer, very much like Dill plays with Jem and Scout Finch in the text. So again, we see so many parallels between the life of the author included in her text. And the time in which this is set is the end of slavery, it's the post-Civil War, and the social structure of the South really changes. The land, because no one really has any money, as we can see in the text, even the wealthy, the land and ancestry is the deciding factor for wealth. So if we take a look at this sort of pyramid, we see plantation owners and professionals. This is what makes up the upper class. These are people who lived in the area for generations, owned large plantations, and they were the ones who were the most educated. Now, the Finches, though not necessarily part of the upper class, were the upper middle class. So they were professionals, right? We know that Atticus Finch was a lawyer, right? So the middle class would be the small town business owners and small farm owners. And the Cunninghams actually are included as a part of the middle class. But again, remember, no one had very much cash during this time. Then we had the Yules, which we learned about the little boy in the very beginning who has license here. He's made up of the Yules, and he's the lower class, right? The African Americans were the emerging group for this lower class, and the unskilled laborers. So the individuals or the characters that make up this class would be Calpurnia as well as Tom Robinson. Calpurnia, we know, is a nanny or a lady who serves the Finches in their home. And then Tom Robinson, which we'll soon discover, is an individual who is accused of rape later in the text, and he's an African American male. So those are the two that make up that lower class. And then we take a look at the Great Depression and the collapse of the world market. So obviously there's poverty, there's unemployment. 13 million workers lost their jobs during this time. The farm prices fell by 50%. The average income was $750 compared to $275 for the farmers. So they were really struggling during this time of the text. The U.S. economy, very little cash. Even the landowners did not have much cash to exchange, which explains quite a bit in our text, To Kill a Mockingbird. The farmers had difficulty selling their crops, so farming was 25% of the economy as opposed to now, which is just 2%. The value of the crops dropped by 27%, which made it very challenging for them to sell the crops. Now, sharecropping as the new slavery, because the landowners, right, they provided small houses, they provided the tools, they provided the seeds, they provided the food, the clothes, and all medical expenses for the farmers in this case, or the sharecroppers. So many would argue that that became the new slavery because they gave them all of these things, but then at the same time, you had to pay to play. So the landowners get profit of all the crops that were harvested. The sharecroppers were forced to use all of the land for farming, so there was no room for their crops to grow, so they had to go grocery shopping. So in essence, then those sharecroppers had to pay money to the store owners where they bought their groceries and to the landowners. And so there was a failure to sell crops and they were unable to pay their bills. So that's why many people said, well, sharecropping was the new slavery, right? So racism and oppression in the South, there was the social issue was segregation. And, during this time, those in a position of power found a way to sort of circumvent the law. And so we have the 15th Amendment, which was the voting rights. And so in ways in which they challenged the voting rights is that they would tax you to vote. They made it difficult for you to find the location. You had to pass a literacy test. And the only way to, if you didn't pass that literacy test, you just had to have a grandfather clause, which just meant that you had a grandfather who had voted. And so then you were then allowed to vote. In 1935, there was a Social Security Act, and that allowed for retirement and unemployed workers to receive compensation. This didn't apply to any farmers or domestic workers, which we know from the previous pyramid that this sort of alienated and marginalized Blacks. And then there was a GI Bill, and it should be 1944. It provides education and low-interest mortgage loans for veterans from World War II, and it really favored those in segregated suburban areas. So the implications of slavery is that you were possibly killed, you would face no charges, the murderer would face no charges, there were lynching from the KKK. So if you questioned or had any bias towards segregation, you'd be killed, right? And then the KKK, they were lynching, they were tar and feathering. People were just running out the Blacks. And then the publication of To Kill a Mockingbird, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And then 1955, we hear about Rosa Parks. So this is really what sets the stage, historical context, the parallels between the life of the author Harper Lee and the narrator in To Kill a Mockingbird.